Tonight, the House tilts right. The final results of the midterm elections falling in as former President Trump prepares to make a major 2024 announcement, plus a stinging UN resolution calling Israeli occupation of a Palestinian territory an ongoing violation.
The Palestinians are decimating any chances of reconciliation.
And undersea threats, securing the vast network of pipelines under the sea floor.
We've become a more digital, globalized world. More and more data flows under the sea.
All this and more on Faith Nation. All eyes on 2024 as we await an announcement from former President Donald Trump. Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Jenna Browder. With the dust still settling from the midterm elections, Washington now looks to 2024 and who will run for the White House. Former President Trump is promising a big announcement tonight, many thinking it's his moment to throw his hat into the ring. The CBN News Capitol correspondent Matt Galka is here to break it all down. Matt, lawmakers are also back in Washington.
Yeah, it's kind of like the first day of school, even though every race hasn't officially been decided. But the picture is a little more clear as lawmakers return to Capitol Hill. Democrats held the Senate. It looks like Republicans will get the House, but it leaves Republicans looking for answers about somewhat disappointing results. New Republican senators joined Minority Leader Mitch McConnell in the first trip back to Capitol Hill since the midterm elections.
Hard to get here, hard to stay here. So while you're here, why don't you try to accomplish something?
McConnell didn't answer questions about any potential challenge to his leadership, although fellow members are calling for change after Democrats held on to the chamber.
I'm not going to vote for Senator McConnell, and I've been very clear about that. I feel very strongly about that, and I said that before this election. So will somebody challenge him? I don't know. I don't give advice to my colleagues.
As votes were still being counted in some districts, members of the 118th Congress took their class photo on the Capitol steps. Control of the House is leaning towards Republicans, but with a slimmer margin than many expected.
There still is a path toward 218.
Democrats sounded empowered after a predicted midterm drubbing never happened.
The so-called GOP red wave turned into a red wedding for extreme MAGA Republicans and election deniers in race after race after race all across the country. Here's the Republican response. The cult leader should run again.
Former President Donald Trump played a large role in many midterm contests that included losses in some higher-profile races, including the Arizona governor's race, where the AP called the race for Democrat Katie Hobbs over Trump pick Kari Lake. Lake's response came in this tweet. Now the speculation is Trump will announce another White House run tonight at Mar-a-Lago. His former Vice President Mike Pence gave this answer when asked about whether Trump should run again.
I think that's up to the American people. But I think we'll have better choices in the future.
Now, Pence himself wouldn't commit to a potential White House run, although he did add that he and his family are praying about the future. His memoir, So Help Me God, launches today. Matt Galka, CBN News.
All right, Matt, thank you very much. And here now to discuss, Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections. Nathan, welcome. So your thoughts on Donald Trump's announcement tonight, and will it carry as much weight as it would have prior to last week?
Well, until he makes that announcement, there's always a little bit of suspense, right? That President Trump likes to keep people in suspense. So hopefully it's not just another announcement about a future announcement. I expect him to run again, whether it's announced tonight or not, and he's going to be the front runner for the nomination as a former two-time nominee. It doesn't carry quite as much weight considering many of the highest profile endorsed candidates didn't do as well in these elections, but he's still the most popular person among base Republican voters. And until someone takes that away from him, he has to be regarded as the front runner.
Do you think Ron DeSantis is in that position to do that?
Well, he's certainly the highest profile challenger at this point. We'll see if he ends up, he's sort of talking a big game, either privately with donors or his advisors. We'll see if he ends up doing it. But the best thing for DeSantis would be a one-on-one battle versus former President Trump. If there are multiple non-Trump candidates, that could just divide those voters who do want to turn the page from Trump. If Trump ends up not winning or not running, DeSantis will be the initial front runner, but there will be a whole host of other candidates, including multiple senators such as Tim Scott of South Carolina, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Glenn Youngkin. There will be a whole host of Republicans trying to win that nomination.
Yeah, possibly Mike Pence as well. So it's looking like the House is going to go to the Republicans. Do you think Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy gets the Speaker's gavel?
Well, he passed one hurdle today when Arizona Congressman Andy Biggs, internally within the caucus, mounted a challenge. I think it was trying to show that McCarthy doesn't have the support that he needs within the caucus, and McCarthy won that vote easily. But that doesn't guarantee that he has those votes when Congress comes together in January for that first vote. He doesn't have it locked up. I was intrigued by Nebraska Congressman Don Bacon, a Republican, saying that if McCarthy doesn't have the votes, he'd be open to working with Democrats on a consensus speaker choice, and that added some intrigue to this. But McCarthy's the front runner, but it's not a lock.
As Matt reported, there's dissension in the ranks in the Senate side, too. Josh Hawley announcing he won't vote for Mitch McConnell as minority leader. Also, Rick Scott announcing he would challenge Mitch McConnell. Your thoughts on that, Nathan? Just a few seconds left.
Yeah, so far we have 2 Republican senators out of 50 or 49 that are, said they're unhappy with McConnell. McConnell he's the front runner, and Rick Scott would have been in a better position to make this challenge if Republicans had taken back the Senate under his chairmanship of the NRSC, and that's not what happened. They fell short, and it's hard to see how he can leverage that into knocking off McConnell as leader.
All right, Nathan Gonzalez of Inside Elections, it's always good to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Good to see you, Jenna.
Well, overseas tonight, Russian missiles have crossed over into NATO territory, killing 2 people in Poland. That's according to a senior U.S. intelligence official. The attack comes hours after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky outlined Ukraine's conditions for peace in a speech at the G20 summit in Indonesia. Zelensky telling G20 members the war should, quote, end justly and on the basis of the UN Charter and international law, adding that Ukraine should not have to make compromises with its conscience, sovereignty, territory, and independence. Russia's response, raining down missiles on Ukraine's capital city, hitting residential buildings in the heart of Kyiv. The surge in attacks comes after Ukraine's successful liberation of the city of Kherson. With that, let's bring in Bill Roggio, senior fellow and editor of the Long War Journal of the Foundation of Defensive Democracies. Bill, good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. So 2 people killed in NATO territory. The Pentagon today stressing the United States' commitment to NATO and defending its territory. How should the U.S. respond here?
Yes, good evening. And the U.S. should be very careful. NATO should be very careful how it responds. This does not appear to be a direct attack on Poland by Russia. It appears that the Russians were trying to strike targets in western Ukraine, and these missiles either were errant, they lost course, or it's possible they were intercepted by Ukrainian air defense and they splashed down in Polish territory. If this was an attack, a direct attack, that would be quite the different story, and NATO would have to consider how it would respond. But this is a point where everyone should be acting with caution. We do not want this war to spiral out of control.
Yeah, this incursion into NATO territory comes after President Zelensky's visit to the newly liberated city of Kherson, which he said marked the beginning of the end of the war. Bill, rather than the end, though, could missiles landing in Poland be the beginning of a major escalation, regardless of intent for Russia?
Yeah, regardless of the intent, if NATO countries aren't careful, and I'm seeing some, particularly in the Baltic countries, making some pretty bombastic statements describing this as an attack and dangerous escalation. We have to be careful, again, how we respond, because this is a war right now between Russia and Ukraine. The West, NATO, is supporting Ukraine's efforts, and it's going quite well. There's no reason for NATO to get involved in this war at this point in time, nor do I think it should. Ukraine is not a NATO partner, but we should continue supporting. But we do not want to jump into a war. Look, the reality is Russia is doing badly in Ukraine. Russia is not a threat to Western Europe. It's not a threat to Eastern Europe. Perhaps the Baltic countries is only place where it could be a direct threat to NATO countries. So this is why we need to tread very carefully. Wars can quickly spiral out of control. We're talking about countries with nuclear weapons, and we need to take care.
Yeah. All right, Bill Rogier, we have to leave it there. We appreciate you coming on tonight. Bill Rogier with the Long War Journal at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, a prize for terrorists and their campaign against Israel. That's what critics are calling a new UN resolution. That story next. Welcome back. Global terror threats facing the U.S. are evolving and becoming more dangerous. That's according to a top security official testifying before Congress today. The greatest threat to Americans, domestic extremists.
The greatest threat to us in the homeland is lone actors in small cells, typically radicalized online, using easily accessible weapons against soft targets. That group includes two categories, both domestic violent extremists and homegrown violent extremists, which are foreign terrorist inspired. So they're very similar, but it's two big buckets.
Another major concern for congressional leaders, the border crisis, including the 2.7 million illegal immigrants crossing the border this year. Still, security officials maintain the border is secure. Counterterrorism in the Middle East, threats from China, Iran, and North Korea were also focal points today. A prize for terrorist organizations and their campaign against Israel. That's how a recent vote by the United Nations is being described. It supports a resolution that accuses Israel of annexing and occupying Palestinian territory. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
The UN resolution called for the International Court of Justice to address the ongoing violation by Israel of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination from its prolonged occupation, settlement, and annexation of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. The resolution passed 98-17 with 52 abstentions, with the U.S., Australia, and Canada joining Israel in voting no. The resolution considers parts of Judea and Samaria, Israel's biblical heartland, along with East Jerusalem, where the Western Wall and Temple Mount stand, to be occupied territory. Outgoing Prime Minister Yair Lapid condemned the resolution, saying, supporting this move is a prize for terrorist organizations and the campaign against Israel. Israel's UN ambassador Gilad Erdan blasted the resolution.
By calling to involve the International Court of Justice, the Palestinians are decimating any chances of reconciliation.
Erdan also tweeted Israel cannot be occupiers in their own homeland. The resolution repeatedly says Israel is under a breach of international law. But Thomas Sandel, the founder of the European Coalition for Israel, says the resolution itself ignores history and international law established by the San Remo Resolution in 1920.
What the San Remo Resolution, of course, said was that this is the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. And nothing could be more Jewish than the old city of Jerusalem. And to say anything else on a UN level is a complete breach and disrespect of international law.
Sandel finds it ironic that this year marks the 100-year anniversary of the British Mandate in 1922.
I think the significant part in the text, also in the San Remo resolution, was to, first time in the history of international law, to make it very clear to say that there is a cultural, religious, and political link between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Although at the time the Jewish population here was a minority, what would later happen is, of course, that this minority with new immigrants would rebuild this country to what it is today and everything we see around us, which is a modern miracle and something to be celebrated and not condemned by the United Nations.
This UN resolution comes on a wave of Palestinian attacks against Israelis this year. This latest happening today in the Jewish community of Ariel, where a Palestinian man killed 3 Israelis and wounded 3 others before he was shot and killed by security forces. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
When we come back, a wake-up call for world leaders and the importance of protecting the sea floor. In September, Europe's Nord Stream gas pipelines were damaged by suspected Russian sabotage. This was a wake-up call for world leaders on a massive security threat. Oil and gas pipelines, they're not the only critical infrastructure lying underneath the sea. The global internet also runs through cables along the ocean floor. Caitlin Burke explains.
When you look out over the ocean, you don't often think about what's under the surface. But all over the world, there are millions of miles of fiber optic cables crisscrossing the ocean floor. They're not much larger than a garden hose, but they're responsible for transmitting up to 95% of global internet traffic.
Fiber optic cables, cables across the ocean are not new. We've had them since the mid-1800s, different forms, copper. But over the years, as data has become more and more important, as we become a more digital, globalized world, more and more data flows under the sea.
As of 2022, there are approximately 530 active submarine cables running all over the globe. In addition to transmitting texts and emails, they also send confidential information like financial transactions and government communications. Without this tech pipeline, the internet wouldn't function, and our digitally driven societies would grind to a halt. Nadia Shadlow, a former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, says protecting these cables and their data needs to become more of a priority.
Anytime an economy is so dependent on infrastructure or a particular sector, it becomes strategic, right? It becomes a point of vulnerability. So our adversaries and competitors recognize this.
U.S. adversaries also recognize the cables themselves are incredibly vulnerable.
Many people will be aware that the actual fiber optic is about the diameter of a human hair. So there might be a couple of dozen fibers inside a cable, but most of the cable is basically to protect the fiber, which is made out of glass. So it's very, very fragile.
While direct sabotage could easily result in damage or destruction, Gavin Tully, an engineer and partner at a firm specializing in subsea cables, says this internet infrastructure is also at risk from fishing trawlers or even natural disasters.
About 10 months ago, there was a massive volcanic eruption in Tonga, and that eruption created a lot of earthquakes and mudslides that cut all the cables to Tonga. So Tonga was basically without communication for weeks because the ash cloud also blocked the backup satellite.
In October, cable damage near the Shetland Islands north of Scotland led to suspicion that an adversary might be trying to make sabotage look like an accident. That's because a Russian research vessel designed to survey the sea floor was reportedly in the area at the time. And it wouldn't be the first instance of an enemy severing a country's communications.
During World War I, England cut all of Germany's subsea cables, which were telegraph cables at the time, of course, some 100+ years ago.
Russia's war against Ukraine and this summer's Nord Stream pipeline incident served as a wake-up call for many of our allies. France proposed spending more than €3 million for ocean floor defense in its 2023 budget. Italy and the UK are also reportedly working to increase surveillance of their underwater cables. And Taiwan is now taking protective measures to ensure communications to the island aren't knocked out by a natural disaster or conflict with China. Here in the U.S., meanwhile, experts are concerned the government isn't doing enough.
We need to develop a better public-private approach toward understanding when these cables become under threat, so to share information more effectively. To also probably fund more cable repair ships as well.
Most cables running to and from the United States are owned by either telecom carriers or private companies. Over the past few years, it's been predominantly content providers like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon investing in new lines. Shadlow says while the owners are ultimately responsible for security and repairs, the government should be involved as well, given national security interests. CBN News reached out to Google for information on how they protect their cables. A spokesperson responded that the best protection against disruption is having a variety of redundant network paths. That means they're not reliant on one single cable.
So the idea is basically creating a global mesh of these types of cables so that if one gets damaged or cut, whether it's on purpose for sabotage or accidental or a natural disaster, it doesn't have significant effect on the global economy.
Another vulnerability in our internet infrastructure comes when the data flowing through the undersea cables reaches land. It's at this point where the information is offloaded. The U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence classified the possibility of cyber attacks against cable landing stations as a high risk to national security. Finally, countries like China could use state-owned companies to sabotage parts of these undersea networks. Huawei Marine, for example, has built or repaired almost a quarter of the world's cables. Some experts already worry Beijing could have tasked them with spying on the data coming through.
We need to be able to provide alternatives to countries and companies that look to Huawei Marine for their components. Similar to the situation with 5G, right? We didn't like Huawei controlling that infrastructure.
While conversations are being had in Congress about securing our internet infrastructure, national security experts like Shadlow say no significant action has been taken. Still, the information sent through these cables grows more and more sensitive, becoming more enticing to our adversaries and more vital to protect. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Still ahead, a silent gathering in honor of the UVA shooting victims. Finally tonight, students at the University of Virginia and the Charlottesville community are grieving the 3 students killed in Sunday's shooting. Thousands attended a vigil on UVA's South Lawn. The 3 victims, Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., and Deshaun Perry. St. Paul's Memorial Church also held a service to remember them. CBN News talked to Bill Wilder, Executive Director of the Center for Christian Study, who called this an opportunity to show God's love.
My prayer is just that the Christian community here, including the Study Center, is going to be a real light to this community in the midst of this darkness, and would appreciate prayers to that end.
Community members described the 3 victims as leaders and role models on the UVA football team. Gone too soon. And thank you so much for joining us tonight on Faith Nation. We'll see you right back here again tomorrow. Have a great evening.